Certain artifacts possess a gravity of their own. They emerge from the sediment of time not as mere objects, but as anchors, pulling down the present into the cold, silent depths of a past that was never meant to be disturbed. Such an artifact is a portrait from the year 1847. It is a daguerreotype, a mirror with a memory, capturing a face so profoundly at odds with nature that it seems to challenge the very notion of humanity. This is not a story of ghosts or phantoms in the conventional sense. Instead, it is a far more tangible haunting, one etched in silver and mercury, a chilling record of a family's devotion to a principle so absolute it led to the creation of a child who should never have been. If the quiet corridors of forgotten history are where you feel most at home, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, consider subscribing to join our assembly of researchers and ensure no story is ever truly lost. The object in question surfaced not in a grand estate or a curated collection, but in the most ordinary of final resting places for the unwanted and the forgotten, the attic of a farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, a place that had seen generations of the same family live and die within its walls. The house was being cleared out in the early 2000s, its contents slated for auction, its history to be scattered to the four winds. A man named Phineas, a distant cousin tasked with the grim duty of sorting through the remnants of a lineage he barely knew, was the one who found it. He worked under the oppressive heat of a late summer afternoon, the air thick with the scent of dried timber, dust, and decay. Sunlight, strained through a single grimy window, illuminated swirling motes of dust, turning the cavernous space into a silent, golden tomb. For days, Phineas had sorted through brittle letters tied with faded ribbon, moth-eaten clothing that disintegrated at his touch, and rusted farm implements whose purpose had long been rendered obsolete. He had grown numb to the intimate archaeology of the task, the act of sifting through the physical evidence of lives concluded. The trunk was at the very back, tucked under the eaves, a large dome-topped chest bound with iron straps. It was not locked, but the hinges screamed in protest as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed linens and a collection of dried, pressed flowers that crumbled into brown powder, was a small, leather-bound case. It was no larger than a prayer book, its surface worn smooth with time. There was no name, no identifying mark, only the year, 1847, delicately tooled into the leather on the back. Phineas, a man who appreciated the small, quiet craftsmanship of a bygone era, felt a flicker of curiosity. He ran a thumb over the worn velvet lining inside the case. It was a daguerreotype, a style of photograph he recognized from his hobby of collecting 19th century ephemera. These were not common things. The process was expensive, laborious, and often reserved for the wealthy or for moments of profound significance. A wedding, the commemoration of a patriarch, or, most somberly, a final image of a loved one after death. 2. The plate itself was a sheet of silver-plated copper, polished to a mirror finish. 3. Phineas held it carefully, tilting it back and forth. The image on a daguerreotype is notoriously elusive, appearing as a negative or a positive depending on the angle of light. 3. As he angled the plate towards the weak sunlight filtering through the attic window, the ghostly, latent image began to resolve itself from the silvery void, and Phineas grew very, very still. The oppressive heat of the attic seemed to fade, replaced by a profound and unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Staring back at him from across more than a century and a half was the face of a child. The portrait was not a work of art in the traditional sense. It was a document, a cold, clinical, and brutally honest recording of a subject who sat before the camera for the long exposure time required in 1847. 4. The child was seated stiffly in a high-backed chair, their hands resting unnaturally still in their lap. The clothing was simple, a dark, homespun dress or tunic that gave no immediate clue as to the child's gender, but it was the face that commanded absolute, unwavering attention. It was a face of impossible geometry. The forehead was unnaturally large and bulbous, seeming to swell upwards and outwards, dominating the upper half of the composition. Below this massive brow, the eyes were set profoundly far apart, separated by a bridge so wide and flat it seemed to belong to another species entirely. The eyes themselves were large and dark, but they held a peculiar vacancy. They stared directly into the lens, and by extension, directly at Phineas, yet they betrayed no hint of emotion, no flicker of curiosity or fear. They were like two dark pools of water, reflecting everything and revealing nothing. The rest of the facial features seemed to collapse inward. The nose was small and underdeveloped, the mouth a thin, straight line. The jaw was narrow and receded, creating a profile that was almost avian. Yet, for all these jarring deformities, there was a disquieting symmetry to the face. The left side was a near-perfect mirror of the right. This was not the random asymmetry of a typical birth defect. It was something ordered, something intentional in its wrongness. The silver surface of the daguerreotype seemed to flicker in the dim light, and for a moment, Phineas had the unnerving sensation that the child's expression had shifted and that the vacant stare had sharpened with a glimmer of awareness. He felt an instinctual urge to close the case, to return the image to the darkness of the trunk. It felt like a violation to look upon it, like he had stumbled upon a secret that had been deliberately buried. The photographer, whoever he was, had made no attempt to soften the subject's appearance. There was no gentle lighting, no flattering angle. It was a direct confrontation with the child's existence. The starkness of the image was what made it so powerful. It was not pitiful. It was terrifying in its silent declaration. This child existed. This face was real. The question that immediately formed in Phineas's mind was not just who the child was, but why anyone would choose to preserve such a haunting image. Portraits of this era were meant to be flattering, to present an idealized version of the subject for posterity. This portrait did the opposite. It was a testament to an aberration, a permanent record of a profound and disturbing secret. Driven by a morbid curiosity he could not quell, Phineas took the daguerreotype with him. He left the rest of the attic's contents to the auctioneers, but this small, leather-bound secret felt different. It was not merely an antique. It felt like a piece of evidence. He began to inquire among the older residents of the nearby town, a small, insular community where memories were long and stories were passed down like heirlooms. He was careful, at first, not to show the photograph. He spoke only of the family, of the old farmhouse, and asked what people remembered. The responses were guarded. The older folk, people in their 80s and 90s whose grandparents would have been contemporaries of the child in the portrait, would nod slowly. They remembered the family, not by name, but by reputation. They were a people who kept to themselves, who owned a significant tract of land that bordered the state forest. They were known for being proud and aloof, unwilling to mix with the other families in the valley. They worked their land, sold their timber, and came into town only when absolutely necessary, their faces set like stone. 5. When Phineas gently pressed for more detail, a common thread began to emerge, a whisper that had persisted through the decades. The family, it was said, did not marry outsiders. The lore was not dramatic or sensational. It was stated as a simple, unchangeable fact, like the direction of the prevailing wind or the hardness of the winter frost. They were a closed circle. For generations, they had married their own cousins. The reasons were believed to be practical, rooted in the hard realities of 19th century rural life. 6. Land was everything. To marry an outsider was to risk diluting the family's holdings, to cede a portion of their wealth and influence to another name. By keeping their bloodlines contained, they kept their property intact. It was a form of dynasty building on a small provincial scale. But the whispers carried a darker undertone. The old-timers spoke of the family's pride turning into something else, something that bordered on arrogance. They began to see their isolation not as a necessity, but as a virtue. They considered their blood superior, their lineage something to be protected from the corrupting influence of the outside world. They had, in essence, created their own private, sealed society on their sprawling farm, a kingdom of 2 or 3 families, endlessly recycling the same genetic material. The whispers never mentioned a specific child. They spoke more generally of troubles that had befallen the family from time to time, of children born unwell or not right. These were vague, euphemistic terms, the kind used by a polite church-going community to paper over a reality too grim to be named directly. The stories were of babies who did not cry, of children who did not grow, of strange illnesses that seemed to plague the family and no one else. The community pitied them, but from a distance. Their self-imposed isolation had become a quarantine, their farm a place that other families instinctively avoided. The portrait, Phineas realized, was the face of one of these troubles. It was the physical manifestation of the local lore, the silent, staring proof of the consequences of the family's unyielding pride. The final piece of the initial puzzle fell into place when Phineas showed the photograph to a woman who ran the local historical society. She was a woman in her late 70s, with a mind as sharp as the daguerreotype's focus. She did not recoil when she saw the child's face. Instead, she looked at it with a kind of sad recognition, as if she were meeting a ghost she had long heard stories about. She told Phineas that she had heard a tale from her grandmother about the family from the Hollow. Her grandmother had claimed that the patriarch of the family in that era, a man of stern and unbending will, had commissioned the portrait himself. It was an act of defiance. The community whispered about his children, about the visible toll of their traditions. The priest had reportedly warned him, speaking of the laws of God and nature. The man, however, was said to have rejected these warnings. He declared that his family was blessed, that their purity of blood was a sign of their strength, not a weakness. He insisted that the child in the photograph was not a curse, but a gift. According to the story, he commissioned the daguerreotype as proof of his conviction. He wanted a record, a clear, unflinching image of his offspring. He saw not deformity, but uniqueness. He saw not genetic collapse, but the singular features of his own tightly wound lineage. The portrait was not a lament. It was a statement. It was a testament to a bloodline that stood apart from the world, a family that would rather create monsters in its own image than admit the possibility that it was wrong. Phineas looked again at the silver plate, at the child's impossibly wide eyes staring out from the past. He now understood that this was not just a forgotten family photo. It was a relic of a terrible faith. It was a sacred icon from a private, isolated religion of blood and soil, a religion that had led its followers to the edge of a genetic cliff. The flickering candlelight from the photographer's studio had not just captured an image, it had preserved a curse, transforming a fragile human life into a permanent, haunting record of a family's inexorable march into darkness. The whispers of the town elders had provided a framework of folklore, a narrative shaped by generations of suspicion and distance. But folklore, however persistent, is not evidence. Phineas understood this. The daguerreotype in his possession was a single stark fact, a fragment of a larger, colder truth. To understand the face staring out from the silver plate, he needed to move beyond hearsay and into the documented record. He needed the official story, the one written in the precise, emotionless script of clerks and clergymen. His search began, as all such searches do, in the county records office, a place where human lives are distilled into names, dates, and legal statuses, all bound in enormous, dusty ledgers. The air inside the archives was cool and still, smelling faintly of acidic paper and decaying leather. It was a library of ghosts, where the only sound was the rustle of turning pages and the distant cough of the county clerk. Phineas, a man now driven by a purpose he did not fully understand, requested the marriage and birth registries for the township covering the family's land, beginning his search in the decade preceding the date on the portrait. The ledgers were heavy, their buckram covers worn smooth by the hands of countless researchers. He opened the first one, for the 1830s, and the brittle pages crackled in protest. The entries were written in a flowing, confident copperplate script. The ink faded from black to a soft, sepia brown. He ran his finger down the columns, searching for the family name the elders had mentioned, a name as plain and solid as the stone foundations of their isolated farmhouse. He found it almost immediately. A marriage record from 1832. The groom's name was Jedediah. The bride's name was Temperance. And beside her name, in the column for the bride's maiden name, was written the very same surname as the groom. They were cousins. Phineas felt a small, cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was not unheard of, particularly in isolated communities where social circles were small. It was a single data point, not yet a pattern. He continued his work with a deliberate, methodical patience. He cross-referenced the marriage with the birth registry for the following years. He found the births of their children listed, each name carefully recorded. Then, he moved to the next set of ledgers, for the 1840s and 50s, looking for the marriages of those children. And that is when the pattern began to emerge, not as a gentle slope, but as a sickening, dizzying spiral. Jedediah and Temperance's eldest son, whose name was Amariah, married a woman named Mercy in 1851. Mercy's surname was the same. She was his first cousin, the daughter of Jedediah's brother. Their second son, Eliphalet, married his own first cousin 2 years later. Their daughter, Keziah, married a man who was both her first cousin and her second cousin, a man whose parents were themselves cousins. The family tree was not branching outward, it was folding in on itself, its lines of descent curving back like vines strangling the trunk from which they grew. Phineas took out a notepad and began to sketch the lineage, his pen moving with a growing sense of dread. The chart he drew was a grotesque caricature of a normal genealogy. It was a web of closed loops and suffocatingly tight circles. The same handful of ancestral names appeared over and over, occupying multiple positions in the same generation. A single great-grandparent might appear 4 or even 8 times in the lineage of one of their descendants, their genetic contribution amplified and intensified with each successive, insular union. The family was not merely a family. It was a closed system, a biological island. They had walled themselves off from the surrounding world so effectively that, after only a few generations, nearly every member of the family was a close relative to every other member. The diagram on Phineas's notepad looked less like a tree and more like a knot, a tangled, indecipherable cipher of names and dates. He found the birth entry for the child in the portrait, recorded in the winter of 1847. There was no first name listed, only the surname and the gender, recorded as male. The parents were listed, a young couple who were Phineas, discovered by flipping back a few pages in the marriage ledger, first cousins, But the connection was deeper than that. The groom's mother and the bride's mother were sisters, and their fathers were brothers. The child in the portrait was not merely the product of a single cousin marriage. He was the culmination of generations of them, the final, concentrated product of a lineage that had relentlessly turned inward, a human crucible from which nothing new was allowed to emerge and nothing old was allowed to escape. The cold, factual script of the county clerk had revealed a history more unsettling than any local legend. The whispers had not been born of simple prejudice or rural suspicion. They were a pale, diluted reflection of a terrifying truth, a truth the family had not bothered to hide from the official record, perhaps because they saw no shame in it. To them, this was not a perversion. It was the preservation of a legacy. It was purity. The county records provided the skeleton of the story, the bare facts of who married whom. To find the flesh, the human element of this unfolding tragedy, Phineas knew he had to go to the church. Families like this, for all their isolation, would have been tethered to the local parish. It was the one institution they could not entirely ignore. Baptism, marriage, and burial were rites of passage that demanded acknowledgement, even for those who held themselves apart from the community. The church stood on a low hill overlooking the town, its white steeple a stark and lonely finger pointing towards the heavens. The current pastor was a young, thoughtful man who listened to Phineas's request with a solemn curiosity. He confirmed that the old parish records were stored in the rectory, in a small, climate-controlled room that served as the church's archive. He led Phineas to a back office, its shelves lined with old books and registers. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax. The pastor located a slim, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with the years 1835 to 1860. He explained that this was the personal diary of a former priest, a man named Father Thaddeus, who had served the parish for that entire quarter century. The pastor said that Father Thaddeus was known to have been a meticulous record keeper, a man deeply concerned with the spiritual well-being of his flock. He left Phineas alone with the journal, the silence of the small room broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The handwriting inside was elegant but dense, the pages filled with observations, prayers, and private anxieties. Phineas turned to the entries for the 1840s, and the name of the family appeared almost immediately. At first, Father Thaddeus's writing was compassionate. He wrote that he worried for the family's souls, isolated as they were. He described visiting their farm, a sprawling property of well-tended fields and sturdy, joyless buildings. He wrote that the patriarch, Jedediah, received him with a cool, formal civility, but that there was a wall of pride around the man that no amount of Christian charity could seem to penetrate. Jedediah politely refused all of the priest's invitations to attend church services more regularly, stating that his family worshipped in their own way, in the privacy of their own home. As the years went on, the tone of the priest's entries began to shift. Compassion gave way to a creeping sense of dread. In an entry from 1842, Father Thaddeus described his profound discomfort upon being asked to sanctify the marriage of Jedediah's son to his own first cousin. The priest wrote that he had taken Jedediah aside and spoken to him plainly. He had told the patriarch that while such unions were not strictly forbidden by the law, they were unwise and flew in the face of natural order. He warned that the church had long recognized the dangers of marrying within one's own close kin. The handwriting, usually so controlled, became slightly agitated in this section. Father Thaddeus recorded Jedediah's response verbatim, a response that chilled Phineas to the bone. The patriarch had reportedly told the priest that his family's blood was their strength and their inheritance. He said that they were a people apart, and that to mix their blood with that of outsiders would be a form of contamination, a betrayal of all their ancestors had worked to build. Jedediah had told him that his children were healthier and stronger than any in the valley, and that their unions were blessed not by the church, but by the sanctity of their own lineage. Father Thaddeus wrote that he felt as if he were arguing not with a farmer, but with the high priest of some ancient pagan cult. The most disturbing entries were those from late 1847, following the birth of the child from the daguerreotype. Father Thaddeus's script, once so firm, now showed the unmistakable tremor of a deeply troubled hand. The ink was darker in places, as if he had pressed the nib of his pen into the paper with desperate force. He wrote that he had been summoned to the farm to see the new infant. He described being led into the dark parlor of the main house, a room where the curtains were kept drawn even in the middle of the day. The family was assembled, their faces betraying a mixture of pride and a strange, defensive anxiety. The priest wrote that the infant was shown to him, and that for a moment he had been unable to speak. He did not describe the child's specific features in the journal. He seemed to lack the words, or perhaps the will, to do so. He wrote only of a profound sense of wrongness, of a divine grammar that had been violated. He wrote that the child was silent, making no sound, its dark, wide-set eyes seeming to look at him with an unnerving, ancient placidity. The entry concluded with a passage that was half prayer, half confession. Father Thaddeus wrote that he had tried to warn them. He had spoken of God's law, but Jedediah and his family adhered to a law of their own making. They had built a fortress of blood to protect their land and their name, but the fortress had become a prison. And now, he wrote, a strange new flower had bloomed within those prison walls. The priest confessed his fear, a deep, spiritual terror that what he had seen in that dark room was not merely an unfortunate birth defect. He feared it was an answer, a judgment. He believed the family had, through generations of calculated arrogance, finally succeeded in creating something that bore their name, but no longer bore a recognizable human form. The dusty, silent parish records had given a voice to the past, and it was a voice trembling with fear. The story was no longer just about a strange portrait or a reclusive family. It had become the story of a priest's crisis of faith and a patriarch's unbending will, a clash of two opposing doctrines, one of God and one of blood. Having traced the family's deliberate path to genetic ruin, Phineas felt a grim resolve to follow that path to its conclusion, to understand the medical and physical reality of the child who had been born at its end. The daguerreotype was a silent witness, its silver surface holding a precise, unwavering account of the child's appearance. The family tree, a tangled knot of repeated names, provided a map of the genetic currents that had converged to create him. Father Thaddeus's journal offered a glimpse into the spiritual dread the child's existence had inspired. But these were all external perspectives. To truly understand the reality of the child's condition, Phineas needed a different kind of record, one that was not concerned with lineage or the soul, but with the stark, physical facts of a human body in distress. He needed the voice of a man of science, a man who would have seen the child not as a symbol of pride or a spiritual omen, but as a patient. The search for such a record was a long shot. In the 1840s, rural medicine was a rudimentary practice, and doctors in small, isolated communities were often overworked and kept inconsistent notes, if they kept any at all. Phineas spent weeks combing through the archives of the county's medical society, a small, neglected collection of documents housed in the basement of the public library. He sifted through ledgers detailing payments for services rendered, letters between physicians concerning difficult cases, and prescriptions for tinctures and poultices. Most of it was mundane, a litany of fevers, broken bones, and childbirths. He had almost given up hope when he found it. A small, leather-bound notebook, its cover embossed with the name of a Dr. Alistair. Dr. Alistair had been the only physician in the region for nearly 3 decades, from 1830 until his death in 1859. His notebook was not a formal medical journal, but a private diary, a place where he recorded his most challenging and unusual cases, perhaps as a way of processing the immense burden of being the sole guardian of his community's physical health. The entries were written in a hurried, almost indecipherable scrawl, the ink a faded rust brown that looked disturbingly like dried blood. It took Phineas several days, using a magnifying glass under the weak library light, to decipher the doctor's handwriting. He was looking for any mention of the family, and in the spring of 1848, he found it. The entry was dated more than 4 months after the child's birth, suggesting the family had not sought medical help until whatever was happening could no longer be contained within the walls of their farmhouse. Dr. Alistair's notes were clinical, yet beneath the detached medical terminology, Phineas could sense a profound and deeply unsettled professional curiosity. The doctor did not use the child's name, referring to him only as the boy from the hollow. His description of the child's physical appearance was precise and unsparing, a medical autopsy performed on the living. He noted the excessive cranial circumference and the pronounced frontal bossing, the cold, scientific terms for the unnaturally large and bulging forehead that so dominated the daguerreotype. He recorded the hypertelorism, his term for the abnormally wide spacing of the eyes. He measured the distance, his notes indicating a gap nearly twice that of a typical infant. He described the micrognathia, the severe underdevelopment of the jaw, and the low-set ears. Each observation was a sterile medical label for the features that, when combined, created the hauntingly alien visage of the portrait. But the doctor's examination went far beyond the child's facial structure. He recorded other, more intimate, physical anomalies. He noted the clinodactyly of the 5th finger on each hand, a permanent inward curvature. He described the unusual texture of the child's skin, which he called abnormally soft and doughy, and the sparseness of his hair. It was a complete, top-to-bottom inventory of a body assembled from a catastrophically limited set of genetic instructions. The portrait had shown a face that was wrong. The doctor's notes described a body that was a tapestry of errors, a living encyclopedia of recessive traits brought to the forefront by generations of relentless inbreeding. There were no supernatural pronouncements in Dr. Alistair's writing, only a grim, methodical accounting of physical facts. Yet, in its own way, his clinical detachment was more chilling than the priest's fearful premonitions. The doctor's notes confirmed that the child's condition was not a matter of interpretation or folklore. It was a biological certainty, the inevitable mathematical result of the family's reproductive choices. The child was not cursed. He was a symptom of a disease that had afflicted his entire lineage, a disease of pride and isolation. The doctor's notes quickly moved from the child's static physical state to his dynamic and deeply disturbing behavior. In an entry from a week after his initial visit, Dr. Alistair wrote that he had been summoned to the farm again, this time with a sense of urgency. The family had reported that the child was experiencing fits. The doctor's description of these episodes was terrifying in its clarity. He wrote that the boy would suddenly grow rigid, his back arching, his limbs stiffening. His eyes, normally so vacant, would roll back in his head, and a low, guttural sound would emanate from his throat. These seizures, the doctor noted, were not the thrashing, convulsive fits he was accustomed to seeing. They were silent, rigid, and profoundly unnatural. He wrote that during these episodes, the child seemed to become an object, a piece of wood, a thing without life or volition. Dr. Alistair confessed in his notes that he had no treatment to offer. The medical science of 1848 had no answer for such a condition. He prescribed a bromide tonic, a standard sedative of the era, but admitted in his private journal that he knew it would be useless. He was treating a symptom whose cause was woven into the very fabric of the child's being. The most unsettling behavioral observation, however, had nothing to do with seizures. The doctor noted repeatedly that the child was completely silent. He never cried. He never made the cooing, babbling sounds of a healthy infant. He simply existed, a quiet, watchful presence in the dark rooms of the farmhouse. Dr. Allister wrote of holding a candle near the child's face and seeing the pupils fail to contract properly. This led him to a chilling hypothesis, recorded in a later entry. He wrote that the boy possessed a severe aversion to sunlight. The family confirmed this. They told the doctor that on the rare occasions they had taken the child outdoors, even on an overcast day, he would not open his eyes. He would turn his face away from the sky, a silent, instinctual rejection of the outside world. This explained, the doctor surmised, why the family kept the house in a state of perpetual twilight, with the heavy curtains always drawn. The child was a creature of the shadows, his existence confined to the dim, still air of the isolated farmhouse. He was, in a very real sense, a prisoner of his own biology, his world circumscribed by the walls of the house, just as his genetic potential had been circumscribed by the boundaries of his own family tree. Throughout his entries, Dr. Allister made note of the family's own peculiar reaction to the child's condition. He wrote with a kind of baffled frustration about their utter and absolute denial of the reality before them. He described trying to explain to the father and grandfather, Jedediah, that the child's afflictions were likely the result of the family's long history of intermarriage. He used the agricultural terms they would understand, speaking of livestock and the dangers of breeding from the same small stock pool for too long. He told them that new blood was needed to ensure strength and vitality, that nature itself demanded diversity. The patriarch, Jedediah, had listened to the doctor's counsel with a stony silence. Then, just as he had with the priest, he had rejected it completely. Dr. Allister recorded the man's words, his tone a mixture of clinical disbelief and professional offense. Jedediah had told him that the doctor saw only weakness because he was an outsider, incapable of understanding the true nature of their bloodline. He had insisted that the child's silence was a sign of a thoughtful, contemplative nature. He claimed the seizures were not fits of illness, but moments of communion with some unseen world. He declared that the child's aversion to sunlight was a mark of his uniqueness, a sign that he was not meant for the common, sunlit world of ordinary men. The family had constructed an entire mythology around the child's pathology. In their eyes, he was not sick. He was special. He was not a victim of a genetic curse. He was the recipient of a unique gift, a gift only their pure, undiluted blood could produce. They insisted, the doctor wrote with a clear sense of astonishment, that the child was a blessing. This detail was, for Phineas, the most disturbing revelation of all. It was one thing for a family to make a series of disastrous choices out of tradition or a misguided desire to protect their assets. It was another thing entirely to be confronted with the devastating consequences of those choices and to then declare them a triumph. They were not merely blind to the truth, they were actively at war with it. They had looked upon the child's suffering and rechristened it as a mark of divine favor. The doctor's stained, rust-brown journal entries painted a picture not just of a medical tragedy, but of a profound and terrifying psychological delusion. The family was as trapped by their pride as the child was by his own malformed body. The doctor's final entry on the case was short and grim. He wrote that the family had dismissed him, telling him his services were no longer required, They would care for the child themselves, in their own way. As he left the farm for the last time, Dr. Alistair noted, the house looked darker and more silent than ever. A tomb for a living child, a fortress where a family was slowly, deliberately, and proudly presiding over its own extinction. The formal records of the church and the clinic had provided Phineas with a chillingly detailed portrait of the child and his family. Father Thaddeus's journal spoke of a spiritual crisis, of a family whose pride had become a religion unto itself. Dr. Alistair's notes provided the cold, hard science, a clinical litany of the physical consequences of that religion. But there was a third current of history, one that ran deeper and darker than the official accounts. It was the history of the common people, the story told not in ink and ledger books, but in whispers over fence posts, in cautionary tales told to misbehaving children, and in the collective, unspoken anxieties of a small, isolated community. This was the realm of folklore, where the child ceased to be a patient or a parishioner and became something else entirely, a supernatural event, a living omen. To uncover this layer of the story, Phineas returned to the town, not to its archives, but to its oldest inhabitants, the living repositories of its unwritten history. He sat in dimly lit parlors, sipping lukewarm tea, and listened as the memories, once guarded, began to unfurl. He learned that the child's existence, despite the family's profound isolation, had not remained a secret for long. Secrets, in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, had a way of seeping out from under closed doors and drawn curtains. A delivery boy bringing supplies, a farmhand hired for a season, a distant cousin paying a reluctant duty call. These were the conduits through which fragments of the truth had trickled out into the wider community. And as these fragments spread, they were amplified and distorted by the prism of rural superstition, transforming a medical tragedy into a Gothic tale. The stories were not uniform, but they shared a common, fearful heart. Several of the oldest residents, recalling tales told by their own grandparents, spoke of a blight that had fallen upon the land immediately surrounding the family's farm in the years following the child's birth. The fields of their neighbors, which had once been fertile, began to yield stunted, withered crops. The corn grew pale and thin, and the potatoes were said to come out of the ground twisted into grotesque human-like shapes. The source of this agricultural decay was, in the minds of the local farmers, clear and unambiguous. It radiated outward from the silent, shuttered farmhouse on the hill. The belief was that the child's unnatural presence was poisoning the very soil, a creeping corruption that leached the life from the earth. The most vivid and persistent rumors, however, centered on the livestock. Story after story emerged of animals behaving strangely, of a deep and instinctual terror that seemed to grip them whenever they were near the family's property line. Horses would shy and rear for no apparent reason on the road that ran past the farm. Cattle would refuse to graze in pastures that bordered the family's land, huddling together at the far end of the field, their eyes wide with a primal fear. But the tales went beyond simple animal anxiety. There were darker accounts, stories of a sudden and inexplicable sickness that swept through the neighboring farms. A farmer, it was said, found his entire flock of chickens dead one morning, their bodies cold and stiff in the henhouse, with no sign of predator or disease. Another spoke of a prize-winning sow that gave birth to a litter of stillborn, horribly deformed piglets. These events, which might have been dismissed as a run of bad luck or the result of some unknown animal contagion, were instead woven into the growing legend of the child. The narrative that took hold was that the child, in his silent, shadowy existence, possessed a malevolent influence, an invisible aura of death that could cross fences and fields. The locals began to speak of a curse, an unclean presence that blighted everything it touched. It was a classic folk narrative, the ancient belief that a human being who was fundamentally wrong could disrupt the natural order of the world around them. The child, who had never left his dimly lit home, became a scapegoat for every misfortune that befell the community. He was the explanation for the failed crop, the stillborn calf, the sudden frost. He was the hidden cause, the secret sin that had brought a subtle and terrible punishment down upon them all. This fear was not loud or confrontational. It was a quiet, creeping dread that manifested in avoidance. The road that passed the family's farm, once a common route for farmers taking their goods to market, began to fall into disuse. People would take the longer way around, adding miles to their journey, rather than risk passing by the shuttered house. Children were forbidden from playing in the woods that bordered the property. The family's name, when it was spoken at all, was spoken in hushed tones. They were no longer just reclusive or proud. They were seen as custodians of something unclean, something that was best left entirely alone. Their self-imposed isolation was now reinforced by a wall of communal fear. They had wanted to be separate from the world, and the world, in its own fearful way, had finally granted them their wish. The farmhouse became an island of dread in the heart of the valley, a place on the map that people navigated around, a silent testament to a fear that was too deep to be openly acknowledged, but too powerful to be ignored. The silence that surrounded the property was no longer the silence of privacy. It was the silence of a collective, unspoken quarantine. The epicenter of this communal fear was the church. Father Thaddeus, whose private journal revealed his own deep-seated terror, had evidently been unable to conceal his feelings from his congregation. The pastor's anxieties had radiated outwards, giving a divine sanction to the community's superstitious fears. Phineas learned from the current pastor that there was a story, preserved in the oral history of the church, about Father Thaddeus's definitive and public break with the family. The patriarch, Jedediah, in a rare and shocking departure from his isolationist principles, had apparently sent word to the priest demanding that he come to the farm and baptize the child. It was a demand, not a request. Jedediah was not seeking a blessing in the traditional sense. His motive, as the story went, was one of pride. He wanted the child's name entered into the official parish register, a formal acknowledgement of his existence. He wanted the church to put its seal of approval on the product of his family's pure bloodline, to legitimize the child that the community was beginning to whisper about. Father Thaddeus's response, according to the legend, was unequivocal. He refused. He reportedly sent a message back to the patriarch, stating that he could not, in good conscience, perform the sacrament. He would not welcome into the body of Christ a soul that he believed was the product of a profound and unrepented sin against God's natural law. The priest's refusal was a momentous act. In the tightly knit, God-fearing world of the mid-19th century, to be denied baptism was to be cast into a spiritual wilderness. It was a public declaration that the child was outside the bounds of the Christian community, a soul left to wander in a state of perpetual limbo. This act solidified the child's status as an outcast, not just socially, but theologically. The priest's refusal was a sermon preached without a pulpit. It confirmed the darkest fears of his flock. If the man of God himself would not touch the child, then surely the whispers were true. Surely the child was cursed. The story of the refused baptism became a cornerstone of the local folklore. It was the moment the family's separation became absolute. They were not just isolated, they were excommunicated, cut off from the one institution that bound the community together. Jedediah had sought validation, but what he received was a definitive and damning judgment. The church, which should have been a place of solace and inclusion, had instead become the final authority that condemned his child to the shadows. Phineas reflected on the brutal irony of the situation. The child, who had never committed a single act, who had never spoken a word, had become a monster in the public imagination. He was a blank slate onto which an entire community had projected its deepest fears. Fear of the unknown, fear of divine retribution, fear of the other. They had taken a sick, disabled boy, a victim of his own family's arrogance, and transformed him into the villain of their own dark fairy tale. Was the child truly a source of some supernatural malevolence, as the folklore suggested? Or was he simply the most visible and tragic victim of human choices, his story a canvas upon which others painted their own anxieties? The answer, Phineas suspected, was far more terrestrial and far more tragic. The curse was not in the child. It was in the blood that had made him, and in the fear that had defined him. The family had sought to hide their legacy in the shadows of their farmhouse, but the folklore had dragged it out into the harsh, unforgiving light of public myth. And the myth, in the end, was a far more powerful and enduring prison than any physical walls. The folklore provided a haunting, atmospheric narrative, a story of a community's fear and a child's transformation into a local legend. But legends are fluid, shifting with each retelling. Phineas, in his role as a reluctant archivist of this forgotten history, felt a need to return to the cold, hard certainty of the documented record. The child had been born in 1847. Dr. Alastair's notes chronicled his medical state into the spring of 1848. The question that now loomed was a simple and stark one. What happened to him? The child, who had cast such a long and dark shadow over the imagination of the community, seemed to simply vanish from the pages of history. Phineas's first stop was the most logical one, the federal census records. These documents, taken every 10 years, were the government's attempt to create a comprehensive snapshot of the nation's population. They were methodical, bureaucratic, and, in their own dry way, a powerful tool for tracking the lives and movements of individuals. Phineas had already seen the 1840 census for the township. It listed the family patriarch, Jedediah, his wife, and their numerous children and grandchildren, a sprawling, multi-generational household living under one roof. It was a document that, on its surface, looked like any other record of a large, prosperous farming family. The names were all there, a testament to the family's deep roots in the valley. With a growing sense of anticipation, Phineas unrolled the microfilm for the 1850 census. The census taker, a man with a neat looping script, had made his way to the family's farm on a hot day in July of that year. Phineas scanned the columns, his eyes moving past the familiar names. Jedediah, now listed as the head of household at an advanced age. His sons and their wives, their names a familiar echo of the marriage records he had already studied. He was looking for a male child, born in 1847. He reached the bottom of the list for the household, his finger tracing the final entry. The child was not there. The census taker had recorded the names of several other grandchildren, children born both before and after 1847. But the boy from the daguerreotype, the silent, watchful child from Dr. Alastair's journal, was absent. He had been erased from this official, national accounting of who existed and who did not. It was possible, of course, that the census taker had simply made a mistake. Such errors were not uncommon, but given the family's obsession with their lineage and their profound secrecy, the omission felt less like an accident and more like a deliberate act of concealment. They had presented their household to the federal government as a complete and orderly unit, and the child, in all his profound disorder, had no place in that official portrait. He was a secret to be kept, a flaw to be hidden from the scrutinizing gaze of the outside world. The absence in the census was a significant clue, but it was not definitive proof of the child's fate. Phineas knew he had to turn to the records of the dead. He returned to the county courthouse, to the same cool, silent room where he had first untangled the family's suffocatingly tight genealogy. He requested the death registries for the years between 1848 and 1850. The clerk, a man who had by now become accustomed to Phineas's grim research, retrieved the appropriate ledger without a word. The book was thinner than the others, its pages filled with the stark, final facts of human existence. Phineas began with 1848, running his finger down the list of names, a somber roll call of the community's departed. He found entries for elderly farmers who had succumbed to old age, for young women lost in childbirth, for infants taken by the fevers and plagues that were a constant, brutal reality of 19th century life. The family's name was not among them. He moved to the ledger for 1849, and there, on a page yellowed with age, he found it. The entry was stark in its brevity. It listed the family's surname. In the column for the first name, the space was blank. The age at death was listed as 2 years. The cause of death, in the looping, slightly hurried script of the county clerk, was recorded as fever. It was a neat, tidy, and utterly conventional end to a life that had been anything but. A common childhood ailment had claimed a young life. It was a story that was tragically familiar, one that would have raised no eyebrows, prompted no questions. It was the perfect explanation, the perfect way to close the book on a chapter the family was desperate to end. But Phineas, having read Dr. Allister's detailed clinical notes, knew that this was a fiction. The child was not suffering from a simple fever. He was suffering from the accumulated weight of his own ancestry, a condition for which there was no name in the medical lexicon of the time. The official cause of death was a lie, a convenient and plausible fabrication designed to obscure a much more complicated and disturbing truth. The family had not only hidden the child in life, they had sanitized his death, reducing his profound and unique tragedy to a common, unremarkable statistic. They had erased his reality and replaced it with a lie that was as neat and orderly as the rows of crops in their well-tended fields. The nameless entry in the death ledger was the final act of their long campaign of denial, a campaign that had begun with the patriarch's proud declarations to the priest and the doctor, and had ended with this single, deceptive line of ink. The final piece of the puzzle, Phineas knew, would be the grave itself. A death certificate was a piece of paper, but a headstone was a permanent physical marker, a final statement to the world. He went back to the old church on the hill. The churchyard was a quiet, sloping piece of ground behind the main building, its grounds dotted with leaning, weathered stones. The grass was long and damp with the morning dew. Phineas searched for the family's plot, which he found in a far corner of the cemetery, set slightly apart from the other graves, a final testament to their enduring isolation. The headstones were large and imposing, carved from solid granite, a display of the family's wealth and status. He saw the graves of Jedediah and his wife, their names and dates carved deep into the stone. He saw the graves of their children and their children's spouses, the same few surnames repeated over and over again, a stony echo of the marriage ledgers. And then he saw it. Tucked away behind the larger, more ornate monuments, almost hidden in the shadow of the patriarch's imposing tombstone, was a small, simple stone. It was so weathered that the inscription was barely legible, the stone covered in a fine, green lacework of moss. Phineas knelt down, the dampness of the earth seeping through the knees of his trousers. He ran his fingers over the surface of the stone, tracing the faint, shallow letters. There was no name. There was no date of birth or death. There was only a single crudely carved letter, a B for boy, and beneath it, a simple 6-word epitaph, a child of God taken home. The hypocrisy of the inscription was breathtaking. The family that had defied the priest, that had refused to have their child baptized, had, in the end, used the language of the church to mark his final resting place. The epitaph was not an expression of faith. It was an act of public relations, a final, desperate attempt to normalize the child they had both created and concealed. It was a message intended for the prying eyes of the community, a pious and sentimental statement designed to be the final word on the matter. The child was not a monster from a folk tale. He was an angel, taken back to the heaven from which he had come. But the most chilling detail was the grave itself. It was nameless. Even in death, they had refused to give him a formal identity, a first name that would have made him a unique individual. He remained what he had always been to them, a symbol, a concept, a product of their bloodline. He was simply the boy, a generic and anonymous title for a life that was anything but. Phineas stood up, looking at the silent, moss-covered stone. He realized then why the daguerreotype had survived. The family had been meticulous in erasing the child from every other record. They had hidden him from the census, falsified his death certificate, and given him a nameless grave. They had tried to scrub the memory of his existence from the official history of the world. But the portrait was a different kind of record. It was a private document, a piece of their own internal mythology. It was the image that proved Jedediah's conviction, the testament to the gift their pure blood had produced. They had destroyed the evidence, but they had kept the icon. The daguerreotype was not a memento of a lost child. It was a relic from a private religion, the one sacred object that had survived the collapse of their faith. It had been preserved not out of love, but out of pride, a final, chilling artifact of their profound and unwavering delusion. The records, once unearthed, painted a complete and devastating picture. From the first cousin marriage in the 1830s to the unmarked grave of 1849, the story was a closed loop, a self-contained tragedy that had played out in the shadows of a rural valley. For over a century, the history of the child and his family lay dormant, scattered in fragments across dusty archives and the fading memories of a community. The farmhouse was eventually sold, its contents dispersed. The family line, weakened by its own suffocating purity, dwindled and finally disappeared from the region altogether. Their legacy was nothing more than a collection of imposing, moss-covered headstones in a forgotten corner of a churchyard and a series of whispers that had long since lost their context. The story should have ended there, buried under the accumulating sediment of time. But one object had escaped the general decay. One artifact had survived the family's meticulous campaign of erasure, the daguerreotype. The small, leather-bound case, which Phineas had rescued from the suffocating heat of the attic, became the sole surviving vessel of this dark and singular history. Phineas, a quiet man of simple hobbies, found himself the unlikely custodian of a profound and unsettling secret. He held not just an antique photograph, but the physical evidence of a genetic and psychological abyss. For years, he kept the portrait in a drawer, wrapped in silk, taking it out only occasionally, studying the child's impossibly wide eyes in the privacy of his own home. He felt a strange and heavy sense of responsibility. To show the image to others felt like a violation, a continuation of the cold, clinical gaze that had defined the child's short life. But to keep it hidden felt like a betrayal, a final surrender to the family's desire for concealment. He was the sole archivist of a case that had long gone cold, and he did not know how to properly honor the memory of the silent, nameless boy. The decision was eventually taken out of his hands. An acquaintance, a curator at a small university museum specializing in the history of photography, heard about Phineas's find and asked to see it. With some reluctance, Phineas agreed. The curator, a woman named Alara, was not a folklorist or a genealogist. She was a historian of technique and technology. When she looked at the daguerreotype, she was not immediately struck by the child's deformities, but by the remarkable quality of the image itself. She noted the incredible sharpness of the focus, the masterful control of the light, the sheer, brutal clarity of the portrait. It was, she declared, a technically superb example of the form, produced by a photographer of considerable skill. Her professional interest gave Phineas an idea. He agreed to loan the portrait to the museum for an upcoming exhibition on early American photography. He felt that by placing it in a historical and academic context, he could honor the child's existence without sensationalizing it. The portrait would not be presented as a morbid curiosity, but as a historical document, a window into the unvarnished realities of the 19th century. Before the exhibition, the museum's experts conducted a thorough analysis of the daguerreotype to confirm its authenticity. Using non-invasive spectroscopic techniques, they verified the composition of the silver plate and the chemical residue from the developing process. Their findings were unequivocal. The object was a genuine daguerreotype, created using the exact methods and materials common in the late 1840s. The leather case, the velvet lining, the delicate tooling of the date on the back, every element was consistent with the era. The experts had authenticated the object. Phineas, through his painstaking research, had authenticated the story behind it. The exhibition opened in the autumn of 2009. The daguerreotype was displayed in a simple, unadorned frame, set against a dark gray wall in a dimly lit gallery. It was given a simple, factual label, unnamed child, circa 1847. American, artist unknown. There was no mention of inbreeding, no hint of the dark family history. The portrait was presented without comment, allowing the image to speak for itself. And speak it did. In the quiet, contemplative space of the museum, the child's face had a staggering impact. Visitors would approach the small, silvery plate, lean in to get a better look, and then physically recoil. A palpable silence would often descend upon the section of the gallery where the portrait was hung. People stood before it, transfixed, their faces a mixture of pity, revulsion, and a deep, unsettling fascination. The child, who had spent his entire life hidden from the world in a darkened room, was now the subject of a steady, unending stream of silent gazes. The story, however, did not remain confined within the hushed walls of the museum. A photograph of the daguerreotype was included in the online catalog for the exhibition, and from there, it escaped into the digital wilderness. The image was copied, shared, and reposted across countless websites, forums, and social media platforms. It was stripped of its context, its provenance, its quiet dignity. It became a viral sensation, a piece of digital folklore for the modern age. It was given lurid, sensational titles, often proclaiming it to be a portrait of an alien, a demon, or some other supernatural entity. The child's face, once a closely guarded family secret, was now a global curiosity, stared at by millions of anonymous eyes on glowing screens around the world. The internet, in its own chaotic and amoral way, had resurrected the whispers of the 19th century villagers. Once again, the child became a monster, a blank slate onto which a new generation projected its anxieties about the unknown and the unnatural. The online world, much like the small town in rural Pennsylvania, had taken a human tragedy and transformed it into a piece of gothic horror. Phineas watched this digital afterlife unfold with a sense of profound sadness. The very thing he had sought to avoid, the sensationalization of the child's existence, had happened on a scale he could never have imagined. In the end, the child had been consumed by the public gaze, his image endlessly reproduced, his true story almost entirely lost. And so we are left with the portrait itself, a silent, silver mirror reflecting our own complicated reactions. What is the ultimate meaning of this haunting image? Is it, as the family believed, a testament to a unique and special lineage, a gift of their unwavering pride? Is it, as the villagers whispered, the mark of a curse, a malevolent presence that blighted the land and frightened the livestock? Is it, as the doctor clinically noted, simply the tragic, biological endpoint of a series of foolish and arrogant choices? Or is it something more? Perhaps the portrait is a mirror in a more profound sense. When we look into the child's wide, vacant eyes, we see not a monster, but a victim. We see the ultimate consequence of an ideology that values bloodlines over humanity, purity over compassion, and pride over love. The child is a symbol of all the silent, forgotten lives that have been sacrificed on the altar of some rigid, unyielding belief system. His deformities are not his own. They are the physical manifestation of the deformities of his family's worldview. The daguerreotype, in its cold, unflinching clarity, does not preserve the image of a monster. It preserves the evidence of the monstrosity that created him. It is a permanent, haunting record of a crime for which there is no statute of limitations, a crime committed not against the laws of man, but against the fundamental laws of nature itself. The child in the portrait remains unnamed, his voice forever unheard. But his image speaks with a chilling and timeless eloquence, a silent sermon etched in silver and light, a final, unanswerable question staring back at us from the void. The record on the nameless child of 1847 is now complete, and your presence through its final page is a testament to the importance of bearing witness. If you have just found our archive, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive so you are here when the next file is unsealed, and tell us in the comments how this story has settled within you.